If you didn't catch that, James will have them up on the screen. So follow along in your Bibles if you have them. If not, follow along on the screen. This is the Gospel of Mark. In verse 27 of chapter 8, Jesus and his disciples came to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who are people saying that I am?" "John the Baptist," they said, or some say Elijah, or others say you're just one of the prophets. "What about you?" asked Jesus. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter spoke up. "You're the Messiah," he said. He gave them strict orders not to tell anyone this about him. Jesus now began to teach them something new. He said, "There's big trouble in store for the Son of Man. The elders, the chief priests, and the scribes are going to reject him. He will be killed, and after 3 days he'll be raised." He said all of this quite explicitly. At this, Peter turned him aside and started to scold him, my Bible says. Up on the screen it says, he started to rebuke Jesus. Jesus turned around. He saw the disciples, and he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," or "Get behind me, you accuser," he said. "You're thinking human thoughts, not God's thoughts." So he called the crowd to him with his disciples, and he said, "If you want to come the way I'm going, you must say no to your own selves. You must pick up your cross and follow me. Yes, if you want to save your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life because of me and this message, you'll save it. After all, what use is it to win the world and lose your life? What can you give in exchange for your life?" Now skip ahead to Mark chapter 9, starting at verse 30. I'll give you a second to flip the page. We're skipping over a little bit there, but this is the same, we are caught up in the same moment, the same story, okay? Mark chapter 9, verse 30. Then they went away from there, and they were traveling through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know, because he was teaching just his disciples. The Son of Man, he was saying, is to be given over into human hands. They're going to kill him, and when he's killed, after 3 days, he'll rise again. We've heard this recently, haven't we? They didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum. When they got into the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" They said nothing, because on the way, they'd been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. Jesus sat down, he called the 12 disciples to himself, and he said, "If you want to be first, you have to be last. You have to be a servant of all." Then he took a small child, he stood in the midst of them. He hugged the child and said to them, "If anyone welcomes one child like this in my name, they welcome me. And if anyone welcomes me, it isn't me they welcome, but the one who sent me." The gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Here we find in both last week's reading and this week's reading, Jesus and his disciples walking along the way, as Mark says. I want to read a short poem by Spanish poet Antonio Machado. It's very short. "Wanderer, your footsteps are the road, and nothing more. Wanderer, there is no road, for the way is made by walking. By walking, one makes the road, and upon glancing behind, one sees the path. That path will never be trod again. Wanderer, there is no road, only wakes upon the sea." That's a poem by Spanish poet Antonio Machado. That poem in particular is fond of folks who walk the Camino de Santiago. Anyone familiar with the Camino? It's an 800-kilometer pilgrimage from France to the north of Spain. Christians have been walking along this way for a very long time. Anyone remember when Arthur Boers was here about this time last year? Anglican priest, remember that guy? He wrote a book called "The Way is Made by Walking." And it's his memoir through walking the Camino de Santiago. He loves that hike.
It's a great book.
I haven't read it, but Pastor Rick, you have Pastor Rick's endorsement. And I think we have a copy around here, maybe, if you want to take it over. So it's this pilgrimage that Christians have been walking for a long time from France to the north of Spain to, do you know what the destination is? The tomb of St. James. They say that James was actually buried there. That is his burial site, and so people walk along this way contemplating life and death and Jesus and the journey. And so this poem by the Spanish poet is fond of those who make this pilgrimage. And that line in the middle, the title of Arthur's book, is uniquely profound. The way is made by walking. I've been to Spain. Rebecca and I have been to Spain. We did quite a bit of walking. We walked everywhere, like no Ubers, no nothing. We walked everywhere that we went for those 2 weeks. And we actually did a couple guided walking tours. We did this one guided walking tour through the Gothic Quarter. And this week in my notebook, I ran into a note that I took during that walking tour. I'm going to read it to you, okay? The title is Follow the Leader. And it reads, on our walking tour today, I couldn't see our guide, but I could follow the person in front of me. This is a picture of living, moving, and walking in community. That's the note. I know, it's not very profound, okay? It's not very deep. It's, what do you call it? Stream of consciousness. I write these things down as I walk through life. It's that there's nothing earth-shattering there, but it is true, right? It's a good image of what it looks like to walk in community, especially faith community. That's what I was writing about, which is sometimes we're trying to journey along with Jesus, and we just can't seem to see where he's going. But what we can do is follow the people who are walking along the way with us. And that's you. Look around the room. These are the people we journey with in faith. So there is something profound to it. It's not my most profound thought, but there it is. It's a work in progress. Either way, there's certainly truth in that sentiment, that the way is made by walking. This is particularly topical for me right now because as summer fades into fall, which it has over the last day, today being the first day of fall, hunting season begins very soon for me. And I spend a lot of time in the woods throughout the year, preparing for the season, exploring new areas to track and hunt white-tailed deer. A couple weeks ago, I was scouting a new area in Wainfleet, in the Wainfleet Bog, which is exactly how it sounds. It's very boggy, it's very thick. In some senses, like it can be dangerous. There are two established populations of Massasauga rattlesnakes in Ontario. One of them is the Wainfleet Bog. So beyond just like getting lost in the woods, there's the rattlesnakes you have to deal with. So I'm out there last week, and I was exploring an area that I had never been to before, an area I had marked on the map, an area where I know just from looking at the map there should be deer, there could be deer, but I'd never been there before. It's not near the parking lot, so other hunters aren't there very often. As I descended into the forest, I realized there were no paths, which is different from other areas I hunt. So I had to make my own path. I had my machete, and as I'm pushing through brambles and climbing over sticks, I pushed as far as I could go into this, like, to me at least, this virgin ground looking for sign of deer. And I saw some signs, I saw some exciting things, I marked them on my map. And I use this map on my phone. It's a digital GPS to track where I'm going so that if I don't know where I am, I can just pull up my phone and follow the line back to where I came from. Okay? Thank God for the supercomputer that's in our pockets, this technology that keeps us safe in some senses. But I try not to use it in an effort to like hone my skill as a woodsman. So I have it as a fail-safe, but I try not to use it. So I push all the way into the forest. I've gone as far as I can bear. And I find a place, you know what, I might hunt here. And I turn around, and I didn't need to use my phone. I could see where I had come from because I had made a way by walking. I had pushed through the thick undercover of the forest. I had used my machete to clear a way. I had made a way by walking that didn't exist before. And as I turned around, like the poet says, well, there it is. There's the way. I didn't need to use my phone to get back to where I had come from. Yes, on the Camino and in the woods, the way is made by walking. But on the journey of life, following Jesus, listen to this, The way has been made by the path that Jesus walked. We do not have to make our own way by walking as we try to follow Jesus. He has made a way. We get the privilege of following in his footsteps. So let's check in with Jesus' followers on their way. You may have caught it. In each of our readings today, last week's reading in Mark chapter 8, and this week, Mark says this phrase twice. He says that they were on the way. In the first instance, back in Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples a question. He says, on the way, who do you say that I am? Eugene Peterson, he's the author of the Message translation and one of my favorite pastors. He says, this is the most important question for the Christian to answer. Who do you say that Jesus is? So he asked him along the way, who do you say that I am? And we talked about this last week. Pastor Rick talked to us about it. Peter answers rightly. He says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. In response to Peter's right declaration, Mark says, then Jesus began to teach them something new. It was almost as if in Peter's right declaration that you are the Son of God, his confession that you are God, Jesus was able to teach them something that he wouldn't have been able to teach them without establishing that, yes, I am who you say that I am. So he teaches them this. This is verse 31. He says, we've read this already today, but we'll read it again. There's big trouble in store for the Son of Man. The elders, chief priests, and the scribes are going to reject him. He's going to be killed, and after 3 days, he'll be raised. He said all this quite explicitly. Remember what happened next? At this, Mark says, Peter brought Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. With good intention, I'm sure. And Mark doesn't let us in, right, to what Peter had to say, but we can guess. It's a safe assumption. Jesus is saying, yes, I am God, you're right, and I'm going to die. So Peter pulls him aside and probably says, like, Jesus, that's not the script here. You're right so far, you're the Messiah, okay, we've established that, but now, you got to take care of these Romans. You got to get a horse, we need a sword. We got to go to battle. We got to start training. Some of these guys can't even carry a shield. We got to start training. And Jesus rebukes him and he says, you need to get behind me, Satan, or the accuser. Because what you're saying to me, the temptation that you are bringing to me, which is to take the path of causing suffering instead of absorbing suffering, is antichrist. He says you're thinking human thoughts, not God's. And then in today's reading, Mark uses that phrase again when Jesus asks, hey, what were you guys arguing about along the way? So how did they miss the mark this time? Well, while following in the footsteps of Jesus, they were arguing amongst them about who's the greatest. Again, the disciples routinely putting on a masterclass of missing the point. But I do have to give them a little grace, because the way for us, you and me here, 2024, was being made by the path that they were walking in real time. Okay, they're walking this out with Jesus in real time. We have the privilege of hindsight being 2020, right? They're walking this out in real time. They were discipling to Jesus as he walked the road of suffering, one step at a time. They're literally following Jesus, albeit stumbling a little bit here and there, falling off the path. But God in his mercy, bringing them back on track. Nope, you're missing a little bit. You've missed the mark a little bit. Okay, I do have to suffer and die. Yeah, I'm going to walk you through that. Then they're arguing about the greatest. He says, hey, if you want to be the greatest, you got to be the last. We got to be servants. Okay, so he's bringing them back on the path. So they're following him along in real time, albeit stumbling a little bit. Now, in the 21st century, unlike the first century, it is possible to be a Christian and not a follower of Jesus. This is true for us. This was not true for them. Because if you were not found physically on the way, well then you had no identity as a follower of Jesus. Right? You're either following him or you're not. But in the 21st century, especially in the West, we have the opportunity to self-identify as Christians without actually being followers of Jesus. Christian, it's a popular identity. It's a political identity in some senses. And in many cases, it's altogether unrelated and, frankly, divorced from being an actual follower of Jesus Christ. Listen to this. In most estimates, about 70% of the population in the United States of America self-identifies as Christian. They bear that label. How many of those do you think, again, and these are just estimates, how many of that 70% do you think are actual followers of Christ, doing as he did and becoming like him and following the path that he paved? Shut up. How many do you think? 20? 1%? John's the closest. In most estimates, it's 4%. So this is what I'm saying, right? We have the privilege, it's not a privilege in a positive sense, but we have the privilege to self-identify as Christians when it's convenient, without actually being followers of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. This is possible in the 21st century when it was not possible in the first century. An estimated 4% of self-identifying Christians are actually discipling to Jesus. If the question is not, are you a disciple? The question is, who is discipling me? There is no way getting around the fact that we are being formed by something or someone. For these first century ragamuffins, Peter, James, John, all these folks, they were fishermen, they were tax collectors, they were living under Roman rule. So before meeting this guy named Jesus, they were being formed, they were being discipled, they were apprenticing to something, to someone. Some story, some cultural story. And so in real time, we get to see the unbundling of all this. Jesus is graciously guiding them along, saying, not quite. You believe this, but not quite. Apprentice to me, disciple to me, listen to me. There is no way to avoid the fact that we are being formed by something or someone. The question is not, are you a disciple? The question is, who or what are you a disciple of? What are we giving our attention, our affection to? For some of us, it's fantasy sports. For some of us, it's real sports. For some of us, it's our kids' sports teams. It's, for some of us, modern mindfulness tactics. For some of us, it's our yoga instructor. For some of us, it's Fox News. For some of us, it's CNN. So for some of us, it's Twitter. For some of us, it's Facebook. For some of us, it's TikTok. For some of us, it's Christian radio. For some of us, it's not Christian radio. These things that we listen to, the things that we give our time, our attention, our affection towards, are the things that are forming us. We will become like what we behold. There is no way to avoid this. We are being spiritually formed. The question is, who are we discipling to? For me, the thing that gets too much of my time and affection and attention is Twitter, or X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. Thank you, Mr. Ross. That's the thing that competes with my apprenticeship to Jesus. Because listen, there are lots of things going on in the world, and I like to keep up to date with these things. And so Twitter for me is a great space because I get to curate my feed. I get to follow people and voices that I trust, that have been vetted. I curate them into this timeline so that when something happens, I can look to my timeline to see what folks are saying about this. I keep up to date on Twitter with popular events. I keep up to date on Twitter with things that are my niche interests, like sports and hunting and stuff and things like this. And in its best form, it's just a great place for me. I love to be on Twitter. There are so many issues going on in the world, and so I find myself on Twitter just keeping up to date with all the issues. There's always another issue. Right now, friends, there's always another godforsaken bomb being dropped. And so I go on Twitter, it's like, who's dropping bombs today? Is it nuclear or is it not? Who died today? Oh my God, I find myself so depressed. So I gotta get off Twitter. There's so many issues. And Dallas Willard, one of my one of my favorite thinkers of the modern age. He says this: the greatest issue facing the world today, with all of its heartbreaking needs that you can read about on Twitter, that's my addition. The greatest issue facing the world today with all of its heartbreaking needs is whether those who, by profession or by culture, are identified as Christians will become disciples. This is the greatest issue facing our world today. Will the Christians become disciples, students, apprentices, practitioners of the way of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of the heavens in every corner of human existence? It's the man who knows what he's talking about. He's lived a long life, faithful obedience, a long obedience in the same direction. And he says, from his purview, the greatest issue of facing our world, not just facing the church, our world, is if Christians will become disciples. Will they apprentice under Jesus or not? So, I'm getting a little heated today. I'm sorry about that. I'm feeling bad. Jesus beckons us along this way. He says in the text today, he says, follow me. And our acceptance of following him, of the call, ought to look like apprenticeship to the suffering servant who calls us by name. Yet, contrary to our instincts, the instincts we share with the arguing disciples, the way of Jesus is not a way to glory. It's just not. Contrary to the way of American Christianity, the journey of following Jesus is not infinitely upwards and towards the right. It's not, as Luther would say, Christianity is not a theology of glory, it is a theology of the cross. The journey of following Jesus does not lead to political victory in Rome. It leads to Golgotha. It leads to the place called the skull. And then from there, it goes to a garden. This is the way of Jesus. And he says, if any of you want to come the way I'm going, you must say no to your own selves. You must pick up your own cross and follow me. And so, friends, we don't have to be deceived. We don't have to pretend that journeying along the way with Jesus is challenging. He said it himself. It's a narrow road with a narrow gate. And so it takes practice. It simply takes practice. And this is not beyond Jesus. He said as much. Remember the Sermon on the Mount? His greatest sermon, where he basically lays out the way to live life in the kingdom of the heavens. He bookends it, beginning and end, by saying, you got to practice these things. You're not just going to get it. You got to stumble along the way. Your way is going to be made by walking. But it's been paved for you. But we've got to practice these things. It's formation. That's what this is. It's formation. The way has been made by Jesus. Yet that Spanish poet is also correct. Our footsteps are the road. We walk the way by putting one foot in front of the other, practicing the way of Jesus with each step. Which leads me to something I've been very eager to tell you about, which is starting October 9th, we're going to be having an 8-session bi-weekly course that we'll do together, all in one place at one time, called Practicing the Way. Okay, we're gonna get to practice together. It's not going to be a small group in the sense where we go to different homes of folks in the community. We're all going to get together here and do it together here in the living room. Okay, all the information is online. You don't have to remember anything I tell you right now. James will actually put the thing up on the screen, that Practicing the Way slide for me, James. So if you go to lifeabundant.info, which is our website, you will find everything you need to know about the Practicing the Way course there, and you can sign up there. Okay, it's free. There's childcare available. We're going to all the links to make sure that whoever wants to be here to practice the way with us can be here to practice the way with us. Let me read this. The Practicing the Way course, it's 8 sessions, I told you that. There's teaching, guided conversation, and then spiritual exercises. There is a book called Practicing the Way course. This is all written and curated by a gentleman called John Mark Comer. He's a pastor from Portland. In the course, on the videos, there are all sorts of voices, not just John Mark. There are so many different voices of folks worth listening to. But it's based on a book called Practicing the Way. You don't have to buy the book to go through the course. The course is enough. But if you want a book, get the book. Go see Harold at Heritage Christian Bookstore in St. Catharines and buy the book. I've read it. Pastor Rick is reading it right now. Avery's reading it. There's a podcast for Practicing the Way. You can listen to it. This course is designed to lay a foundation for lifelong discipleship to Jesus. Dallas Willard said, this is the biggest issue facing the world right now. So we accept our responsibility. It's time we apprentice to Jesus, not just call ourselves Christians. So 8 sessions, right? I told you that, bi-weekly. We're going to form a foundational understanding of intentional spiritual formation, and then we'll explore how to follow Jesus in a busy, distracted, secular age. You guys want me to tell you what the sessions are? Okay, session 1, following Jesus. 2, formation part 1. 3, formation part 3. Session 4, the practices. Session 5, meeting God in pain and suffering. 6, healing from sin. 7, crafting a rule of life. And session 8, living life together. Every other Wednesday at 6 p.m. starting October 9th. It's free. Our big kids will take care of your little kids, and we will practice following the way of Jesus together, because that is what it takes. There's no shame in that. Like Jesus spelled it out, that Sermon on the Mount. He says, anyone who practices these things, he says. And then we get to see his disciples, the folks who are actually apprenticing to him, fumbling along, stumbling along, but doing it, practicing. Peter got it eventually. Okay? It took him some time, but he got there. And so we'll get there too, because that's what's before us, friends. And I know this because I'm on Twitter. We live in a dangerously secular age. And I say dangerously because it is a conniving threat to our spirituality that is difficult to perceive in the way that it comes to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well said.
So, it's why I don't have TikTok anymore. It's why I spend less time on Twitter. And it's why we're going to practice the way together. It's why we come to the table every Sunday. You know, Pastor Rick said it last week. There's this, as folks who facilitate this table every Sunday, there is this tiny little voice sometimes in the back of your head that's like, oh, how can we do something different? How can we freshen up this table? And Pastor Rick said it well last week. It's just like hands off. Because this is many things, but for us, one of the main things it is practice. This is spiritually formative. And it doesn't have to be anything beyond that. That every week we come to the table, we look at the bread, we look at the blood. Body broken, bloodshed. It's practice, it's practice, it's practice. And so we're spiritually formed by, I know this because I have kids in this church. You know this because you have kids in this church. You see kids in this church. And you know, you can see how they're being spiritually formed by this practice of coming to the table every week. Friends, adults in the room, we are not beyond that practice. Jesus said it, right? He on the heels of his friends arguing about the greatest, he dragged a child, not dragged, he lovingly ushered a child into the center of attention, and he said, this is the model. Look at the baby. They get it. They're not on Twitter. No, seriously though, they don't care. They're just they're wide-eyed with wonder. They got so much love, so much grace, so much forgiveness. Not a whole lot of patience, but we're working on it. And so, you guys see it in this church, how this table practice forms the life, not just of our kids, but of everyone in this space. So that's why we come to the table every Sunday. I'm here almost every week, but we were not here in the summer for a couple weeks. And one of those weeks we were at camp where they had chapel. And I got to be in worship with my kids for the first time. Because I'm always up here, which is great. But I was not up here. I was back there. And I got to be with them in worship for the first time. It was amazing. And near the end of the service, Asher leaned over to me and says, Dad, when are they bringing out the bread and the juice? So I don't know if he was hungry. But for the sake of this moment, I'm just going to say that he's been spiritually formed. Yeah. And so we come to the table. We practice walk in the way. He's probably just hungry. So, if you're in the room, you're welcome at the table of God. I just say that every time we get up here. Come to the table, we'll break the bread, we'll break off a piece, we'll pour the juice. It's like we do every week, and we will continue to do every week. We will practice. And we'll eat and drink together.
Amen.
So come to the table.